Well, thanks very much for coming today, and big thanks to SNAP for having these noon hour talks. We just live in Maple Bay, so I've been over for about 4 of them now, and each one has been super interesting, fascinating, and I hope I can live up to the talks that I've seen. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my journey of how I got to be standing here today in front of you, because I really have only been creating art for about, I would say, the last 4 years. I've started to really call myself an artist. I am going to go fairly fast over about the first 10 minutes or so, but don't worry, I'm going to take a breath, and the entire talk is not going to be quite that fast. And I'm just going to talk about diving in with some background here. So I grew up in Victoria, moved to Vancouver to study graphic design, and while I was still a graphic designer, I started to really want to spend time away from the computer, and I really got into making handmade accessories. So you can see here, these are scarves that I would trawl in the thrift stores. So I would go into thrift stores, hopefully on a 50% off day, and look for wool sweaters, and take them home, shrink them down in my washing machine. And eventually I learned I needed to go to the laundromat to do that, and cut them up and make them into scarves. So in that sense, I was an urban forager. I would go to the thrift stores, see what was overlooked and underutilized, and take it back to my studio, rework it into something fresh and modern. So for me, the inspiration came from the material. It was the upcycling and the recycling that really got me excited to make things. And this trash to treasure mentality carried directly over into my next creative endeavor, which was vintage jewelry made from upcycled and pre-existing materials. So again, my inspiration came from the material itself, the overlooked, the undervalued. What can I do with that when I find it, and what can I elevate that to? So inspiration came from peeking into the dusty corners of the antique stores and rooting around in vintage warehouses. This is an actual vintage jewelry warehouse in New York that I used to go to. And this is another photograph. And yeah, it's all dirty and dusty, and it's been sitting there from around the 1920s and 30s is when they started manufacturing this stuff. This is just one corner of an entire floor in the old-fashioned district. And I remember my husband and I were in New York, actually for his job. He's a photographer. That's him back there. And so I combined that with going to this blanking. Okay, so I combined it with going to this vintage warehouse, and I came back at the end of the day, and I was filthy, and I was actually bleeding from being poked from little pieces of metal. And he looked at me and he said, "This is fun for you?" And the answer was yes. It's just something I really love to do, because look what you can find when you look in the dusty corners. And I did vintage jewelry for about 10 years. And I never got inspired by walking into a commercial bead store. I would have to go in to get the bits and bobs that you needed, like the wire and the clasps and that type of thing. But I would look at these trays of semi-precious stones arrayed before you, like so many jewels, and I couldn't help wondering, where did these stones come from? How were they mined? How were the people treated when they were taken out of the earth? And that's just the way my brain works. So how does that all relate to basketry? Well, in a way, it was the same impulse that drew me away from the computer when I was spending hours on graphic design. I was spending long hours in the jewelry studio, and after 10 years, my creative interest was really starting to wane, and I was casting about for a different inspiration. And I have a really vague recollection of, in about 2015, I remember reading an article about an artist who had created some kind of outdoor sculpture out of plant material, and this was happening in Richmond, I believe, in a park out there. And it was an outdoor sculpture made out of plant material, and it was made just to biodegrade back into the earth. And I had never heard of anything like this before, and it really captured my fancy. So I dove down a Google rabbit hole, and when I came out, I had discovered in Vancouver the Earth Hand Gleaner Society. Is anyone familiar with Earth Hand? couple of people heard of it. Yeah, they kind of fly under the radar, but they're a super fascinating group. It's run by a couple of artists, and they kind of seem to run on like artist grants, but they're very, very community engaged. I'll just read a little bit from their mission. It's very long, but I'm going to read the short version. Earth and Gleaner Society uses a community-engaged model for creating environmental art projects with opportunities for research, skill development, and skill sharing. So what does that really mean? They're a bit like, almost like a homesteading group, but instead of canning preserves and baking bread, they're growing flax and to make into linen, and they're running a natural dyers co-op. So super interesting people doing really fascinating things. Again, just kind of under the radar in Vancouver. So what they would do is have these open houses, sort of like they were working out of the Vancouver Parks boards, and Vancouver Parks boards have those old little caretaker homes. So they had taken over those caretaker homes. And I can pinpoint with absolute precision the moment I got hooked on basket making. I walked into a room that looked very much like this, and it was covered in these. This is all hanks of dried plant material. And the minute I walked in, like there's a certain kind of aroma that goes with being surrounded by dried plant material. It's a lot like freshly mown hay or something like that. It's a lovely sort of visceral first impression. So I walked in and I could smell this smell, and I could see all these things up on the wall, and I just out of my mouth popped, I think I found my happy place. Just completely unprompted, and that afternoon I was taught how to weave. This little tiny basket is my very first basket, and it's made out of blackberry bark and daylily leaves, and I have been hooked ever since. And this is where the basketry seed was planted, and boy did it ever flourish. I became completely obsessed. So for 2 years, before we had moved back to the island, I got to hang out with Sharon Callis and the Earth Hand Gleaners. And again, they would have these very open, loosely structured afternoon drop-in sessions, and you never know what was going to happen. So that day, one of the first days I dropped by, they were building a living fence out of a living willow, as you do. So this is fresh cut willow, and if anyone knows anything about willow and gardening, you put willow in the ground and it just starts to grow. So here they are creating the fence, sort of a 2-person, 3-person, 4-person job. They're kind of weaving a really rough weave. Willow's very thick, very tough. And so this is the finished little border around where they were actually, this is going to be a bed of flax that they were going to make into linen. That's what they do. And so that's now a living fence. If you go down to Trillium Park in East Van, you'll see this. Another afternoon, Sharon was just doing some materials exploration with tansy, blackberry, and nettle. And what her kind of thing was, what can she be doing with all of the plant material that was being taken out of the parks? Invasive species, Himalayan blackberry, yellow flag iris, they pull this stuff out by the ton. So she's looking at this excess sort of waste material and wondering how much of that can be used to sort of replace traditional basketry material. It's already sitting there. What can we do with it? So materials explorations. This one here is, we've got daylily, we've got blackberry fiber. And she's exploring just the carding it. If anyone works with wool, you'll recognize those paddles. You comb the fibers to make the fibers all line up, and then you can spin the fibers and make it into string or wool. This afternoon, Sharon showed me how to make a simple cordage out of blackberry bark fiber, and you just twist it. That's all you do. And this is the very first piece of cordage I ever made, and it's made out of Himalayan blackberry, what we call bark. It's sort of more like the inner fibrous layer, not the inside pith, and not the very, very outside. It's sort of got this inner cellulose layer. So for me, this was like the ultimate aha moment for me, the ultimate trash to treasure. To take something that is so vilified, the Himalayan blackberry, everyone hates it, right? Except for they love the berries. But if you're a gardener, you hate it. So taking something that everyone is trying to get rid of, trying to hack back every year, and transforming it into something that is basically one of the most basic building blocks of civilization, string or rope. So to me, this moment was absolutely magic. And I'm a huge anthropology / archaeology nerd, and they have dated man-made string to at least 40,000 BC, and new discoveries keep pushing that date back because, as you can imagine, fiber doesn't last long the way pottery shards do. They just decompose into the earth, which is kind of part of the beauty of it. But artistically, like, what can you do with string, right? Well, it turns out quite a lot. This was yet another drop-in afternoon that Sharon was running, and this was, she was making cordage. You see my technique has improved a little bit as we go along. Nice and tight, not all loopy. This is actually a material that is water lily stems. So this is the portion that grows underwater, this beautiful long portion that grows underwater. And Sharon was using this to create art. And this was taking place at the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Chinese Gardens in downtown Vancouver, if you've ever been there. It's a beautiful little oasis in the middle of the city. And they need to pull out and harvest the water lily stems because you can imagine they just keep growing and growing and it chokes out the pond. So Sharon got in there with the hip waders and was harvesting it all out. And she calls herself a community engaged eco artist. So she's always trying to draw the community in her artwork. So this was a piece that she was making, and this shape mimics the shape of the windows on the walls outside of the garden. So she had the idea that she was going to create this shape out of the water lily cordage and install it in the bamboo grove. So here she is starting to install some of the pieces down below in the grove, and these were going to represent water droplets in the pond. And there she is down at the bottom taking a photograph up into, and there's a slightly better photo here of the finished piece installed in the bamboo grove. And again, this was a piece that was just going to biodegrade back into the earth. And so this is where the art really started to come into it for me. And Sharon showed me what could be done just by doing this. It really, again, planted a seed. So moving from Vancouver to Vancouver Island in 2016 coincided with me making the decision to shutter my jewelry business and devote time to diving headfirst into basketry art. Moving house and home was a really good time to just make a clean break and start that transition and dive in. But my husband and I had to have a conversation about finances that comes into it. Are we going to be okay if I don't work basically for 2 years and if I just devote myself to learning about this kind of stuff? Because I said to him, all I want to do is surround myself with sticks. And he said, yeah, we can do that. And so it was time to take the lessons I'd learned from Sharon and the Earth Hand Gleaners to hunker down and just experiment and practice and start to make work. And a big part of that was starting to take the time to learn about gathering natural materials, because that's what really, really did it for me. That's the light bulb for me, was gathering my own natural materials to use in my work. And it was also around this time that I began to seek out basketry classes. Even from the very beginning, I knew I wanted to learn basketry techniques, but use them in a modern context. And there are surprisingly few basketry teachers around here, but I'm very lucky in that Salt Springs' own Joan Kerrigan is one of those teachers who does teach consistently. You can probably count on 3 or 4 classes a year from her. So I became a disciple of Joan's and took pretty much any class that she had. And just before I get too deep into that, I just want to throw up a super basic primer for those of you who might not know anything about basketry, although I do see some members of the Salt Spring Island Basketry Guild here today. Whoop whoop, represent. So if you don't know anything about harvesting your own materials, this is just a basic primer. All material must be dried first because it does go through a shrinking phase. Anytime you want to start to make work, you need to plan ahead. You need to soak and mellow your material. Sometimes, in the case of willow, that could be up to a week, depending on the size of the willow that you're using. Sometimes in the case of cedar, it can be 20 minutes. So it really depends on what you're working with. And then you work with it and it dries into the shape that you've made, and that's magic that I just showed you. I had about 4 pieces, and I thought maybe they'd want to put me in a group show or something like that. And to my utter astonishment, they offered me what amounted to a solo exhibition. I was extremely hesitant because I didn't have a lot of work, but I'm definitely the type of person who jumps in and figures it out later. And I was terrified we couldn't pull it off because we were actually moving right in the timeline of the show that I had time to make pieces for the show. We were moving house and home and studio. But I managed to make enough pieces for the show when we had moved into the new studio, and with the huge amount of help from my husband, he basically kind of decided where most of the things went there. He's very, very good at that kind of stuff. So with the help of my husband, I think it ended up looking pretty good. I pulled it off, and this was in January of this year. And you've probably noticed by now at this point the incredible high quality of the images of my finished artwork. It's all due to that man back there, my husband, making a very funny face, Martin Gisborne. It can be really difficult to get great images of 3D work. I mean, I would argue it's tougher than getting images of a flat piece, a painting, even though that comes with its own set of difficulties. It's really difficult. Like, just to give you an example to apply to this show, you're applying, the jurors aren't seeing your work. The jurors are seeing photographs of your work. You have 3 photographs to submit. So I had 3 photographs to show, like the front, the back, the side, the angle, the shadows, and I can highly recommend spending money on a photographer. Yeah, Ron.
Just to add to that, having spoken to 9 jurists and asking them what they think is the most important thing, and it's the photograph, the image that you submit.
Absolutely.
The quality of it.
Yeah, because the quality of that photograph definitely gives some indication of the quality of your work, and I mean like how much time and money you spent. Maybe you're doing a trade, maybe it's not all about the cash dollars, but the more effort and thought you put into those images, that just really comes across in how you're presenting your final work. So I joke around that I can highly recommend marrying your own personal photographer, but the truth is, he makes me look really good. I'm like, look at that. That's great. I just put up the slide with you in it. This is adorable. So this is So this is a picture that I took of Martin in England. He is British. And we're at the age now where we're starting to go to funerals of our family, unfortunately, and we had to go back to England quite a few times. And the kind of man I married says to me, we're going back to England for this is his mother's funeral, right? And he says to me, let's take some time and carve out a bit of fun. It's not a fun trip, but let's take the time to do something that's going to give us a bit of a break. And what do you want to do? So I'm like, oh, Laura Ellen Bacon has a show, and this is, you can see back here. This is all made out of willow. This is all large scale sculpture that Laura Ellen Bacon does. And I said, can we go to this? I had no idea on the map of England where it was in relation to where we were going. So he just said, sure. And it was way out of the way of where we were going. Like, I felt like we drove over like a quarter of England and back that we didn't need to. But he did it all with a smile on his face because his wife wanted to see some art made out of sticks. So that's the kind of man I married. Thank you, darling. Yeah. So it just brings me to this piece, which is in SNAP, hanging on the wall. Wow. This one's made out of a completely different material than I've talked about so far. And it's a very non-traditional, it's a non-traditional basketry material, that's for sure. You won't find this material really in any of the basketry books that I've been reading. How this came about, it's these new eyeballs I have. Instagram. I follow a lot of other basket makers and fiber artists on Instagram, and if you are an artist, and you're not on Instagram, I would highly recommend getting on Instagram. Even if you're not comfortable posting photographs of your own work, you can follow the hashtags of other people's work and you just get tons of inspiration. I find I get tons of inspiration that way. So I follow a lot of other fiber artists, and it seems like there's a lot of them in Australia. Australia seems to have a very vibrant and supportive fiber art community down there. And I would notice, because I was following these artists over a number of years, I would notice at a certain time of year that they were posting photos of this material, and I was like, what is that? It's Australia, so who knows what it is. But they were saying things like, it's jacaranda season. I'd be like, what the heck is jacaranda? And I would like zoom in and look and try and figure out what this material was, and it just looked like stems. And I thought, well, that's an interesting thing to use. I never thought of using stems. It's obvious to use vines or really long leaves or something like that, but it's really not obvious to me to use something that was a stem. And so I zoomed in, took a really close look, and then I was outside in the backyard one day raking leaves, and we had a lot of big leaf maple trees where we used to live in Courtenay, and I thought, the penny dropped. What if I just rip the top of the leaf off? What am I left with? I'm left with these lovely big leaf maple stems. And petiole or petiole is just a fancy botanical word for stem, but why use a regular word when you can use a fancy botanical word? And I really love the section where it has this lovely curve, and that's where it connects to the main branch. So the leaf will be connecting to the main branch like that. That's the branch, and then that's the big leaf maple leaf right there. And it just is very, it is an organic material, but it's very organic to me, and it just absolutely reminds me of like chicken bones or something like that. And that grasping really spoke to me. So for me, I'm pretty literal. It's not much of a leap to go from bones kind of to blood. I just go there. But I was looking back when I was preparing for this talk, and I was looking back at old photos, and I came across the first time I ever actually used this material, and it really struck me because this was in 2016, and I had been gathering the material up from our backyard, and I made this little guy, and it was actually for a very loosely bound vessel that I made for a bird that hit our window. And it really affected me, this bird that hit the window, because it was beautiful. It was a varied thrush. And I felt partly responsible because I felt I had put the bird feeder too close to the house. But as it turns out, I removed the bird feeder and the birds kept hitting the windows anyway. So I don't think it had anything to do with that. But I wanted to honor this little guy that hit the window. And so I put him in there, and it was very loosely bound because I wanted to send her down the river. We backed onto the Puntledge River, so I wanted to kind of give her a little watery send-off, and I wanted the structure just to disintegrate and fall apart and not interfere anymore with her life, basically. Not interfere with her body returning to the water and the earth. And then, of course, we got down to the river, and it was sunset, and Martin took a beautiful picture of this little buddy before we sent her down there. But it was a really interesting reminder to me that right from the beginning, when I was drawn to this material, it was really kind of tied into this cycle of life. The official catalog description is exploring a temporary suspension of decay in the natural cycle of death and rebirth. A pause to contemplate the passage of time in nature versus the timeline of man. So what do I mean by that? I love to pick these stems off of the forest floor. If I left them there, they would just decay back into the earth. And that's what I mean by the temporary suspension. I'm picking them up off of the ground, kind of elevating this humble material by putting it on the wall. I actually dry them in that shape. So these ones I will go home and probably dry into a shape like that, so they're easier to use. And even though I I do add a layer of encaustic, which is a hot wax. And once this material is dried, it just soaks up that material, soaks up the encaustic. So I do add that. But if you did put this piece outside, it wouldn't be long before it would just biodegrade naturally back into the earth. And I love the idea of elevating the overlooked, the humble. And the bottom line is, for me, I think we all need to sort of respect and elevate nature a little bit more, and that's kind of where that idea comes from. And then as far as the way this piece looked and the choices of to use the red, I kind of wanted that feeling of, you know, when you're out for a walk in the forest and maybe you're alone and you stumble upon an animal skeleton deep in the woods, and you just see its bones kind of coming out from the moss. And it's that sudden shock of wonder and fascination mixed with just a hint of uncertainty. And that realization that we are all made of meat and bone, basically, is a gentle reminder, though, that we might want to remember to accept that death is a part of embracing life. And another important thing to me that somehow got lost in translation, the ingredients of the piece read, if you see the label out there, it reads maple leaf stems, wax linen, and encaustic. And I'm not sure how it got left off the list, but there's also ochre in this piece. And this is a wildcrafted. I picked up a rock that was ochre. Wildcrafted sounds so fancy. But it's important to me to point out because I am currently nursing a mild obsession with ochre. And I found a fist-sized chunk of ochre after these crazy storms this last winter where all those trees were uprooted. Well, in the spring I went out and I was harvesting cedar roots on Maple Mountain because all the cedars were uplifted. And I found this chunk of ochre in this beautiful cold mountain stream. And I was thrilled to find a piece of ochre. I probably wouldn't have noticed it if it wasn't wet and in the stream, because that really brings the colors out. And you're probably familiar with ochre as an earth pigment, as a color. And that's where, if you're not familiar with ochre, that is literally where the color comes from, a chunk of rocks. It comes in a fairly wide color range from like yellow to dark red. And so I did a rough grind up. I ground it up on a rock and mixed it with some of the clear encaustic medium and tried it out. This is just a page on my sketchbook. And I really wanted to use it because I found it when I was making this piece, and I really wanted to use it in the piece because, as you can see, those are the dried maple leaf stems underneath, but they're almost the exact same color. So I put it on the two center spines of the piece, and I knew it was there, but no one else would really know it was there because it was such the same color. So I did decide to introduce just like a store-bought ingredient of a pigment, basically a Mars red pigment, to pop the color. But I know it's there, so it's almost like more like a symbolic ingredient. And I like the idea of something that is included that you don't really see, but it's there. And I think this might be the last slide, and I'm kind of going to end in left field over here. I'm taking a bit of a left turn. One of the reasons I'm obsessed with ochre, I'm just going to explain this. I just found out this nugget recently, and it kind of blew my mind, and hopefully you'll find it interesting. Meet the bearded vulture. This is one of the only animals that is known to purposely seek out ochre-rich pools to bathe in after it eats. The fascinating thing to me is there's fairly recent scientific experiments that demonstrate that ochre, iron oxide, when it is exposed to sunlight, has self-cleaning and sterilization properties. So when it's mixed with biological materials such as sweat or oil or feather oil, it produces reactive chemicals, radicals. These radicals can kill viruses and bacteria and convert smelly organic substances into neutral carbon dioxide gas. So in this way, ochre in sunlight can sterilize and clean the skin and provide health and comfort to make it scentless. So this would have been a definitive advantage for nomadic meat hunters. This research also demonstrates a sanitary reason, possibly, for the vulture's habit in bathing in red ochre. So you can see where I'm going with this. The hypothesis, I'm reading from a science paper, advanced here is that the ochre used by man has its origins in a biomimetic approach. Early man and early pre-man possibly learned about the use of ochre from looking at this guy. And it's entirely possible that that is one of the reasons that the attraction of ochre for ancient humans and pre-human rituals relating to birth and death. And that's it. Oh, did you have a question?
Is that the same for the sandhill cranes then? I know the sandhill cranes have the mud back into them.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Sandhill cranes also bathe their feathers in ochre-rich mud, and I'm not sure. See, because sandhill cranes aren't eating dead and decaying matter, I don't think it's the same effect. I think it might be. I'm guessing. I don't know. Sort of a byproduct, the fact that they're preening, but the mud that they're using is ochre-rich. So it's also interesting. So ending in left field, but that's it. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah, hi.
Do you have your 3 pictures, the photos that you sent to
Oh.
Sherry that you could show us? Or were
Yeah,
you-
2 of those were. I can go back if you want to see them again, but one of them is up here, is that full one, and the other one is the close-up. Would you like me to go back, or yeah? Sorry, you.
It's okay.
I think let's see what happens. Woo-hoo, back in time. Yeah. So that's one of them. Oh, I went too far.
I'm just curious how you decide
Yeah.
what views to
Yeah.
use.
Exactly. It's hard. That one, yeah. So that's one of them where you can really see. I thought it was really important to show the, these as well as the weaving.
Well, I have another question. When you say you're going to go home and dry them, how
Mhm.
do you put it on a mold?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out something right now. I might recruit Martin to try and help me figure that out, but to get a different shape. But all I did for these ones was pretty much dry them within a pot, in a circle shape.
And you moisten it?
These, well, the fresh ones, they're already wet, so I'll dry them into that shape. A lot of times I'll have to. They don't all dry perfectly, right? So I'll have to mist them a little bit and kind of coax them because they're fairly delicate when they're dry. So I'll mist them with water and kind of recoax them into a bit more of a shape that I want for the final shape.
And what you have right now, haven't done anything.
No, these I just picked up in Crofton waiting for the ferry because it's petiole season.
Are there other stems that you think about using?
Not yet. Yeah, I know you have used, Melanie, you've used sumac stems, right? Is it sumac?
Yeah, well, yeah.
What are those like?
Sumac.
Are they?
Beautiful, but Stackler and sumacs die, like ours died. But they're long like that.
Are
and
they?
They're velvet. They're
Ooh,
velvety.
oh, I remember that.
No,
Yeah.
I didn't form them,
Okay.
but maybe if you soak them, you could.
Yeah, maybe. I wonder if they would lose that velvety though.
Maybe, yeah.
There's an experiment.
Yeah.
Yeah, but no, I haven't. I mean, these ones are just so big and expressive that I haven't really seeked out anything else. And they're so generous. They're everywhere, especially this time of year. They're just everywhere. So, yeah.
Technical basket trick.
Yes.
What weight of wax linen did you use?
Good question.
47.
I think it wasn't. I think it was 7, and I actually have some that's up to 12. Yeah.
Did you do the red encrusting on the wax linen
Yes.
and then clear for the rest?
Yes. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Really, really nice.
And it's hard to sort of keep that division, which is why I decided not to try and do that and keep it more blobby, which was a little bit more like just blood,
It's wrapped at the
Yeah. The bottom is a cluster of 3 or 4. Yeah, like that. Actually, 3 or 4 on each side. You can see, like, if I want them to be extra long, that's kind of that's the technique I'm using. So I'm getting these bone ends on both sides, so that's, you can get sort of double the length if that makes sense. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And then so the bottom will be a cluster like that that's wrapped from here to here in wax linen. Yeah.
And the ochre is on top of the red?
The ochre is kind of underneath the red, because that's what I did first. I did the ochre mixed with the clear medium, so that turns it the red color. The wax linen's all underneath that. Sorry, I'm just trying to find.
Was not a colored wax linen.
It was a colored wax linen. Yeah, yeah. So you can see the top. Yeah, so it is. It's red wax linen,
Yeah.
clear and caustic, and then dribbles of red. The brown ochre, which matched these a little too perfectly, and then a red Mars red on top. Yeah. Anyone else? No? All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you.